In this session, we will talk about const, let, and var, three keywords used to create JavaScript variables. What's their difference, when to use let and const, what's the best practice on using these keywords in modern JavaScript. Everything is explained with required prerequisite topics. Please consider watching this video till the end because these topics are really important for rest of your JavaScript learning process. Hi all, welcome to the complete JavaScript beginners tutorial by CodAffection. Keywords in any programming language are reserved words with some predefined meanings to it. In JavaScript, there is around 60 plus keywords. We will get familiar with them as we go forward. In previous video, we have discussed how to create and name JavaScript variables, where the keyword let is used to create new variables. Other than let, we have var and const keywords for creating new variables. Let's discuss how they differ in action and their proper usage. First of all, you should know this, all variable declaration starts with any of these keywords. Let's start with comparing keywords var and let. All the things that I'm gonna talk about let is same for const keyword also. There is only one difference between them. We will get into that later. Previously, before JavaScript version ES6 or ECMAScript 2015, we only had var keyword for creating variables. Both keywords let and const are introduced in ES6, that means in the year 2015. If you are going to remember the introduced version name, either remember ES6 or ECMAScript 2015. Both are same. If you remember both, you will be confused. Let's start with creating variables with let and var. So here is my VS Code editor. Within it I have opened my JavaScript note-taking project. As you might already know, for all the video tutorials here, we have prepared JavaScript notes or theory part into this project here. If you want to know how to benefit from these JavaScript notes here, I have made a separate video. Link is there in video description and inside the icon top right corner. Now back to the topic. We'll be writing JavaScript code within this common practice file here and it will be executed within this file index.html. Currently we are running this project within this web browser using the VS Code extension live server. For now you could ignore these interface or controls here and let's focus on this console window to see the output for JavaScript code writing within this common practice file here. Now let's create variables with let and var. So first of all, we have the variable a. Now to identify this variable is created through let keyword. I will rename this variable as let a. So here we have the variable let a and I will initialize some value 1. Okay. Now let's create another variable using var keyword. I will name this variable as var a so that we can tell this is created using var keyword. Let's initialize that with 2. Before explaining difference between these keywords, we need to have a brief idea on block statement and JavaScript functions. We'll be discussing JavaScript functions in a separate section later in this course. Now, to fully understand this session of these three keywords, we'll be discussing necessary prerequisite topics like this in advance. So first of all, let's start with block statement. It is also known as compound statement. A block statement is used to group multiple statements. To make a block statement, we just need to wrap these statements with a pair of curly braces like this. Now, why do we need a block statement like this? We can discuss that after introducing JavaScript functions. So let's discuss what is a function in JavaScript. Function is one of the fundamental building blocks in JavaScript. It's a group of statements in our code to perform a particular action. Now before saying anything further, let me show you how a function looks like. So first of all, we will start with this keyword function and then provide a name for the function. For now I will name it as print greetings. So this is the function name. After function name we will be having a pair of parentheses like this and then followed by a pair of curly braces like this. We are just using the keyword function along with its associated name before a pair of curly braces like this, which is common to block statement also. But both function and block statement are entirely different in action. Block statement is used just to limit the availability of variables defined within this curly brace here. We will discuss that in a bit. Now let's complete this function here. With this function, as the name suggests, we just need to print some greetings to this developer console here. For that, we just need to do this console.log. Within it, we can pass this message, hi there. So this is a function definition. A function definition alone does not do anything. We have to invoke this function somewhere. To call this function, we can do this print greetings, so the function name, and then the same pair of brackets like this. So this will invoke this function here, and thereby the code or statements within it is executed. So this line of code or statement is executed by which we print this message into the developer console. So this is how a function is defined, and it is invoked like this. Now in other places, if you want to execute this function, we just need to call this function again like this. So the function is defined only once, and it is invoked in different places of our code when it is necessary. So if there is no function and it is having multiple statements like this, instead of calling this function, we may need to rewrite that code like this. And whenever there is a change of code in them, we just need to do that separately in each places like this. Instead of repeating these code in several places in our program, if we were using functions like this, we just need to do the change only here, and the changes will be reflected whenever we call the function throughout the program. So that's the benefit of using function. We will dig deep into JavaScript functions later in this course. For now, just understand how a JavaScript function looks like and how it is used. Function is a prerequisite to understand these keywords let, var, and const. Now, before explaining why do we need a block statement, let's discuss what is meant by scope in JavaScript. I'm just explaining the concept of scope in brief here. We will also discuss JavaScript scope later in this course. So, scope simply defines availability of a variable in our code. Or you could say it adds some encapsulation to the variables. For example, consider the code snippets here. We have declared two variables with let and var. And here we have a block statement. And let me remove these comments from here. Along with this block statement, we need a function to print the values of these variables here. So I will just rename this function as print is. Inside that, we just need to print the values of these variables. So first of all, we have let a. Now let me duplicate this line here. For that, you could use this shortcut Ctrl+C then Ctrl+V. And let's replace this with var variable. And let's call the function here print is. You could see the values printed in this developer console after executing this function print is. Now in JavaScript, there is 4 types of scope: block scope, function scope, module scope, and global scope. For now, let's completely ignore module scope. We will get into that later. If a variable is accessible across the whole application, then it is in global scope. Variable accessible only to a block statement or a function are known as block scope or function scope respectively. Now talking about var variables, they are accessible within the immediate function where it is created. So in that case, the variable will be in function scope. It can't be accessible outside the function. If a var variable is not surrounded by any function, then it is in global scope. It can be accessed anywhere in our application. Let's check that here. Currently, this var variable is in global scope because it is not surrounded by any function. So it is in global scope. So you can access this var variable var a anywhere in this application. And that's how we are able to print the value within this function here. Now let's move this var declaration statement into this function here. For that, you could use VS Code shortcut, hold Alt, then use arrows, down arrow like this. So currently this variable is defined within the function print is. Since this variable is created within this function, we can access it within the function anywhere. But outside the function, we can't access that. So this variable is within the scope of this function here. Currently, we are able to print the value of the variable here, okay, within the function. Now let's move this log statement outside the function. So use the shortcut, hold Alt, then use arrows. So here we have the error var a is not defined. Since this variable is created within the function here, it can only be accessed within the function. That's what we meant by function scope. Now let's undo the changes quickly. Now I want to try one more thing. Let's move this var declaration into this block statement here. Even after declaring the var variable within the block scope, we can access that outside the block here. So block statement does not limit the scope of var variables. Now let me undo this. With the help of developer tools here, we can see variables categorized into different scope. For that, open this sources tab here, and then you could see this tab scope along with watch. Inside that, we can see variables in different scopes. Inside the tab, you could see this message not post. So to see scope of a variable, we have to post the program execution. For that, we need to add debugger into our application or project. Within this tab here, page tab here, you could see the files that we are currently running. And here we have the JavaScript file commonpractice.js. Now we could see the JavaScript code that we have written. Now this is how a debugger works. First of all, we have to add a debugger by clicking on these lines here. So I will add a debugger to the first line like this. Now let's reload this page here. So while executing this JavaScript file, once it reaches this line, it will post the execution. To see line by line execution, you can click on this button here. So that's how a debugger works. At the same time, you could see the values in these variables if you hover on them. Normally we use debugger when there is an error and you want to find which line of code is causing this error. So debugger helps us to debug our application to find what's the real problem behind an error. Here we have used the debugger to see the scope of variables within our application. Currently we have two scopes. Actually we have categorized scope into 4: block scope, function scope, module scope, and global scope. There is also another way of categorizing scope. They are local and global scope. So here we have the global scope. This is similar to the global scope that we have categorized previously. And all of the other scopes, block scope, function scope, module scope, comes under local scope. That's what we have inside this script section here. Currently, as we have mentioned, this var variable is outside all the functions. And we don't have to worry about block statements because block statement does not limit the scope of a var variable. So currently, this var variable must be there inside this global scope here. So let's expand this. And if you scroll down, you must see the variable var a. All of these functions or variables are in ascending order, so you could easily find the variable. So here is the variable var a, and it is initialized with the value 2. In global scope, there will be an object, commonly referred as global object. It will be accessible across the application. If you are a beginner, you may not know what is an object. Just think of an object as a variable. Within it, we have multiple variables. We'll talk about them later. So the global object will be different based on execution environment. In browser, the global object is known as window. You could see the same here. Along with this global, you could see the object name, global object name window. When I say in browser, you could think of applications when JavaScript is executed in client side or front end with HTML. The global object will be different when JavaScript is executed within Node.js server side, where the global object is called as global itself. So based on where JavaScript is executed, global scope object will be different. Since we are discussing JavaScript basics, here it should be explained in a broad sense so that it is applicable wherever JavaScript is used. Since this var variable is in global scope, it will be added to this object window. So the var variable within this window can be accessed like this. Let me switch to the console tab here. Just type window.var a. See? So this is how we can access variables within an object like this. Window, which is the object, dot the variable within that is var a. So the variable var a is added to the global object window, and you could see its value here too. Now let's summarize what we have discussed about scope of var variables. Only a function could limit the scope of a var variable. Once you learn module or module scope later, you will know module scope also can limit the scope of var variable. Don't bother about module scope now, we will discuss that later. If var variable is not surrounded with a function, then it is in global scope. Block statement has nothing to do with scope of a var variable, since function limits var variable scope at lower level. In general, we say var variables are function scoped. Now let's discuss scope of let variables. Let keyword creates block scope variables, meaning let variables will only be accessible within the block for which they are created. In other words, within the immediate pair of curly brace where it is defined that even include function. So anything wrapped within a pair of curly brackets creates a new scope for let variables. So let's check that within our program here. So here is the let variable let a. Since this let variable is defined outside any block statement or a function, it will be accessible throughout this file. Now let's move this let variable declaration to this block statement here. Save, that's it. Here we have an error, let a is not defined. So this is what we are doing here. The let variable is defined within this block statement, and we are trying to access that within this function. Since this variable is created within this block statement, it can only be accessed within this block. So let's move this block statement into this block statement here. Now we could access the variable let a. Since the variable is created within the block statement, it can only be accessed within this block statement, not outside the block. Now let's undo all the changes. Let's move this let variable declaration to this function here. Okay, since function is also a block statement because it is surrounded with a pair of curly brace, so it also creates a block statement for this variable declaration here. It can only be accessed within the function. Now the function is able to access the variable since both of them is in same scope. Now let's move this log statement outside the function. See, here we have the error let a is not defined. Since the let variable is created within the function here, it can only be accessed within this function. In other words, scope of let variable is determined by the immediate pair of curly brace where it is defined, that even include function. So anything wrapped within a pair of curly brackets creates new scope for let variables. Keep this point in mind because in future sessions we'll be seeing statements like if, for, etc. with a pair of brackets like this. All of them creates block scope for let variables. Okay, now let's undo the changes here. Let variables not enclosed in any block statement or a function is only available to the local file. Now that's the case for this variable here. Let variables won't be added to global scope or global object like var variables. So in brief, let variables are block scope. Let variables are only accessible within the immediate pair of curly brackets for which they are created. If there is no surrounding curly brackets, then it will be accessible anywhere within the local file. Let variables are not added to global object or global scope like var variables. A JavaScript module or module scope can influence scope of let variables. We can discuss that in appropriate future sessions. So that's all about scope comparison with var and let. Now let's answer this question. Why do we need a block statement in JavaScript? As you might have guessed, scope defines how long the variable is available in memory. So memory allocated for variables within a block statement will be released after its execution. So that's the only reason for having block statement in JavaScript. And this block scope is introduced in ES6, which was in the year 2015 again. Now I want to tell you an interesting thing. We can create JavaScript variables without any of these keywords. Just like this, I'm going to create a variable, say the variable name something like some variable, and I will just initialize that with some random value. Actually, it may look like an initialization to an existing variable, but even if there is no such variable declared before, this direct assignment creates a new variable. Independent of the place where the variable is created, whether it is in a function or a block statement, the created variable will be in global scope, and thereby you could access the same with global object window like this, window dot some variable. That's it. But this way of declaring variable is not at all recommended in any way. JavaScript has some loopholes like this. Don't fall for it. It creates confusion and problems later in the development process. We'll be discussing how to avoid such bad practices later in this course. So once you initialize a variable like this, it will work like a normal variable. You could do everything that you can do with normal variables, but this way of variable declaration is not at all recommended in any way. Now let's talk about redeclaration. var variables allows to redeclare variables in same scope but not let. Here the word same scope is important. Let's check that here. We have already defined a variable var a. Now let's duplicate this with the shortcut Ctrl+C then Ctrl+V. Now let's initialize this with another value. See, its value is changed here, and thereby the previous declaration of this variable is undone and it is redeclared with this statement here. So it is possible with var variables but not with let variables. Let's try to redeclare this variable. So Ctrl+C then Ctrl+V. Boom! Here we have the syntax error. Identify let a has already been declared. Here in this redeclaration definition, the word same scope is important. If we declare let variables with same name in different block statement or function, it is allowed because they are in different scope. Let's try that here. Let me move this line. Let's try that with this function here. Okay, and let's change this value to 3. So here the variable let a is redeclared within this function. So inside this function scope, the value of this variable let a will be 3. If we try to log the variable outside this function, it will print the value 1. So outside this function scope, the variable let a has this value 1. Since both variables are declared in different scope, there is no conflict. Value of the variable within this function will be 3, and outside the function the variable will be having this value 1. So that's all about redeclaration. Let me undo the previous changes here. Now finally we have to talk about hoisting. We need to have a brief idea about hoisting also. This is also a big topic for another session, but for the comparison here we need to brief this concept. Hoisting is the process of moving declarations to the first stage of program execution. Not physically moving the declaration statement to the top, but while running a JavaScript file through hoisting, memory will be allocated to the functions and for var variables before even executing the first line of code. And thereby we could access such functions and variables even before the declaration statement. First of all, let's check function hoisting. So here we have defined the function print_s, and we have called this function after declaring the function up above. Now even if you move this invocation or calling statement above this function declaration, it still works. See, the value of variables let a and var a is still printing through this function call here. This is possible because of hoisting. Before executing any statement from this JavaScript file, the memory for function will be allocated, and thereby the function can be invoked whenever it is called, even before the definition or declaration. That is what is happening here because of hoisting. The same behavior is possible with var variables, not with let variables. Let's check that here. I'm going to copy this line from here and I will just paste that above the variable declaration. Boom. Even before declaring this var variable, this log statement prints the value of var a. So before any line of statement execution from this file, the memory for this var variable var a is allocated in the memory. When a var variable is hoisted, it will be initialized with undefined. When it reaches up to this line here, it will be initialized with the value that we have provided here. That's what we print from this function here. So after this line of code, the variable will be initialized with the value provided here. Before that, the variable will be having this value undefined. This is because of hoisting behavior in var variables. If you don't know what is an undefined, this value undefined is a keyword in JavaScript. It has some meaning that the variable is existing but not initialized before. We will talk about such values and data types in next session. Even we declare and initialize the variable var variable in a single statement through hoisting, it will be initialized with this value undefined. So through hoisting of var variables, only declaration is happening, not initialization. Now hoisting won't work for let variables. Let's check that here. Let me copy this line from here, and we are trying to access the let variable even before it is actually declared. Let me save this. Here we have the error, cannot access let a before initialization. So hoisting won't work for let variables. That's all about comparison between var and let variables in JavaScript. Whatever we have discussed for let is exactly same for const variables also. There is only one difference between const and let keywords. Let's check that here. Let me declare a variable with const keyword. I will name it as const a and I will initialize that with 0. Variables created through const keyword are called as constants because the value inside them can't be changed in rest of the program. Means once a constant is created, for rest of the program it is read-only variable. We can only read the variable, not to modify it. So it is a must to initialize variables while declaring it. Otherwise we will have this error, missing initializer in const declaration. So we should declare and initialize constants at the same time. Now after that we can't change the value of constant in rest of the program. Let's try to assign a new value into it. See, here we have the error, assignment to constant variable is not allowed. So that's the only difference between let and constant. Rest of the comparisons, scope, hoisting, no redeclaration is same for constants also. Both let and constant are introduced in year 6, that is in the year 2015. Let's discuss best practices while using these keywords var, const and let. So the order of keywords is like this. Use constants wherever it is possible. If constant is not an option, then go for let variables. If it is necessary to have a global scope variable, then only go for var variables. It is least recommended way of declaring variables in modern JavaScript. Here the agenda behind the order of these keywords are based on small scope, thereby early release of memory and less memory overhead. So use constants wherever it is possible. That means in advance, if you know a variable is not going to change its value later in the program, then use constants. If change of value in that variable is necessary, then go for let. As I told you above, the only difference with let and constant is that constant is not going to change its value throughout the program execution. So even the scope is same, for JavaScript engine, memory management for constant is much easier than let variable. Since it knows in advance constants are not going to change their value, the engine only need to take few precautions than changing let variables. You will understand this concept better once we learn what happens behind the scene when a JavaScript program is executed. So that's explained the first priority of constants over let. Now talking about the least priority of var. Now actually in a real world program, after introducing let and constant into JavaScript, var variables are not at all recommended unless if you have a special requirement of leaving the variable in global scope. First of all, var keyword provides topmost scope for its variables, that is global scope. So the variable will take memory space for a long time than it's actually needed. Since it allows redeclaration in same scope, you may accidentally override variables that you don't intend to. That is, you may redeclare variables that you created before, or var variables in other third-party libraries will be redeclared. Finally, hoisting for var variables creates confusions for a developer, like whether it is already defined or not, but the hoisting behavior of a function is expected in common sense. You can find JavaScript notes for this session in our JavaScript note-taking project. GitHub link is given in video description. So that's all for this session. In next session, we will talk about data types in JavaScript. If you found this video helpful, please consider subscribing to this channel, CodAffection. Please like and share this video with your friends and colleagues. See you in next session.